For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, with a grateful g'day to the residents of... What's this? Yes, Ottawa, Canada's capital, is number 15 on our list of all-time views by city. And I also bring you another "What's this?" for alarmists so good at apportioning blame for greenhouse gases down to precise percentages that we're now well past 100%. For instance, according to a Canadian doctor at COP29, the healthcare sector spews 5% of our emissions. Scientific climate alarmism recycles a piece from Carbon Brief on the suddenly vital talks on plastic in Busan, saying, quote, the production, use, and disposal of plastics is responsible for around 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, end quote. And supposedly, aviation is another 2.5%, and, quote, 1/4 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions result from food and agriculture, end quote. Meanwhile, another source says, quote, the manufacturing and production sector accounts for 1/5 of global carbon emissions and 54% of the world's energy usage, end quote. And another, quote, transport accounts for more than 1/3 of CO2 emissions from end-use sectors, end quote, while, at least in Canada, home heating alone accounts for 16% and home energy use in total 24%. Which means we're already responsible for 110% of collective annual emissions before we even get to the oil and gas sector. No wonder there's a crisis of credibility. Then, out of Australia, we bring you some of the least startling news in quite some time. Excessive faith in, and subsidies into, alternative energy have produced an alternative to energy, namely shortages and blackouts. But the big unsurprise is that the politicians responded by blaming the conventional energy sources that they got rid of for causing the problem and touted the renewables that aren't working as the solution. But Australians better get used to it, and not just Australians, as Britain's decline due to aggressive net zero policies joins Germany's as a cautionary tale, with Australia and others knocking at the door. As the Australian put it snidely, quote, mildly hot day leads to major problems for electricity grid, end quote. So, quote, New South Wales residents were told to avoid using dishwashers, washing machines, and pool filter pumps to prevent blackouts, end quote. Yeah, I mean, who needs to wash clothes? Somehow it's the fault of coal, and Climate Change Minister Chris Bowen, quote, will on Thursday tell Parliament it was magical thinking to suggest extending the life of coal-fired power stations past 2035 would make the electricity market more secure, end quote. And magical thinking is something that he knows all about, since, quote, Mr. Bowen promised before the 2022 election that Labour's renewables policy would reduce electricity prices by $275, but household bills have risen since the Albanese government was elected, end quote. And incidentally, Australia has no nuclear plants, despite having fully 1/3 of the world's proven uranium deposits, partly because it has so much low-cost coal that they won't use, and partly because, radioactivity giant mutant ants, or something. Also in the newsletter, we note that a new scientific phenomenon seems to be exploding around us. Call it the fire department effect, because according to the Vancouver Sun, quote, the chief of the Dashwood Volunteer Fire Department near Qualicum Beach is warning people about lithium batteries after one exploded in his home, end quote. Unlike the fire department that burned itself down in Germany, this chief had a smoke alarm. Mercifully, the fire was contained with no harm to people and minimal damage to property, though the Sun does note that, quote, of the 10 fire deaths in Vancouver in 2022, half were caused by rechargeable batteries, end quote. But his battery wasn't even plugged in when it detonated. So if that's the green energy of the future, we'll take the old brown stuff that doesn't spontaneously burn your house down, or your fire station. Then, from the hottest year ever file, we bring you such toasty news as, quote, wind chill to hit -11 Celsius as winter arrives in Ottawa, end quote. Plus, quote, BC's weather forecast is calling for a prolonged snowstorm and up to 25 centimeters of snow, end quote. Not to mention, quote, the forecast suggests this winter will be generally colder and more impactful than last year, with the cold comeback aimed more toward Western Canada, end quote. And if that's too much Canadian winter for you, further south, quote, Massachusetts could get snow, wintry weather around Thanksgiving, Black Friday, end quote. And in Britain, there was snow at Jesus College, Oxford, alma mater of Climate of Gavin Schmidt. And much further east, quote, the biggest November snowstorm to hit South Korea's capital in more than half a century blanketed the capital on Wednesday, grounding hundreds of flights, disrupting commuter traffic, and leaving at least 2 dead, end quote. Good thing it wasn't warmer. Hang on. And then, from the if only they had Google on their computers file, we bring you, quote, Saudi Arabia has experienced its first ever snowfall, end quote. Wow, how extreme is that? Except for the snowstorm of 2016 in Saudi Arabia, and that time in 2022 that, quote, rare snow and hailstorms cover Saudi desert, end quote. Nevertheless, apparently, quote, as social media floods with breathtaking images, the phenomenon is also serving as a wake-up call for climate awareness and the urgency of environmental action, end quote. Yeah, lest the desert become less searingly arid and more breathtakingly lovely or something. And another thing, the rule with rhetorical questions in media headlines is that the answer is always no. Hence, Euronews.green asks breathlessly, quote, could China's CO2 emissions peak by 2025, end quote? No. Especially since they add, quote, experts optimistic about the superpower's green transition, end quote. In the newsletter, we also note that it's hard to keep up with the latest, greatest disappointment in the making from the unicorn power policy factory. But here's one. We got an email from Heatmap Daily saying, everybody loves geothermal. And suddenly everyone does. Natural Resources Canada lurched onto the bandwagon with, quote, the government of Canada invests in geothermal energy in northern Canada, end quote. And by invests, they mean chucking $2 million, which isn't pocket change even to them, into a project that will, quote, engage the community of Etchatl Fort Laird, and support Ako Dene Koe First Nation in determining the best strategies for developing the geothermal resources of the First Nations traditional territory in the Northwest Territories, end quote. Oh yeah, that's going to power a major G7 economy, especially as Acho Dene Koe is a community of 648 people, many resident elsewhere, centered on Fort Laird in the chilly Northwest Territories, just 487 kilometers along Highway 7 from the dim lights of Fort Providence with its 618 people. So clearly there are massive opportunities to export heat pouring from Arctic rocks, or at least massive consulting opportunities about it. Also on the geothermal bandwagon, Heatmap claims that, quote, geothermal could be the big winner of this election cycle, end quote. Yeah, unless it's not, since the piece adds, quote, Democrats and Republicans both love it, but will they find the money for it, end quote. And not to spoil the mood, but we have to add, and if they do find the money, will it become a reliable energy source, or just one more sinkhole for public cash? In the newsletter, we also mentioned that Dr. Javier Vinos, who recently joined us for our third live webinar, whose recorded version is now posted online with our other videos, has written a compelling book, Solving the Climate Puzzle, that offers both a convincing overview of the complexity of climate and an intriguing alternative explanation of both short and long-term warming and cooling to the established orthodox enhanced CO2 hypothesis. Now, it takes some cheek to challenge orthodoxy in any field, but Vinos' justification for doing so is that the conventional theory performs very badly despite all of its advocates' sound and fury, including one aspect of its inadequacy that's hidden in plain sight. Out of hundreds of millions of years of climate vaguely like our own, by which I mean with complex multi-celled life in an oxygen-rich environment, the computer models basically only get about 35 years in the late 20th century right when atmospheric CO2 and temperature rise together, because their creators were dogmatically certain that the former drove the latter, and therefore programmed them to say that it does no matter what the data actually indicate. Vinos lists dozens of relevant aspects of climate that the models boot hopelessly, including contemporary processes as well as historical conditions. So, aren't the dogmatists even slightly ashamed of this performance? And speaking of aren't they ashamed, having face-planted brutally in the 2024 American election with condescending lectures to the rubes about how the experts are always right, the chattering classes are now seeking to undo the damage with condescending lectures to the rubes about how the experts are always right. For instance, Science editorializes that science is neither red nor blue, end quote. Well, that's funny, since Nature and Scientific American both endorsed Biden, and the latter endorsed Kamala Harris, though it had nothing to do with politics, you see, despite neither publication having ever endorsed a Republican. And now the New York Times' David Wallace Wells, post-election, sniffs, quote, as it turns out, the liberal establishment was right on COVID, end quote. Yeah, except on the lab leak, masking, closing schools, focusing on the young and healthy, not the old and unwell, that sort of peripheral stuff. In the newsletter, we also continue our Green Blackout series on the IPCC's concealing of global greening. The IPCC loves summaries. After disgorging one of their mammoth three-part assessment reports, they make summaries of each chapter, plus a summary for policymakers, that's the SPM again, of the whole volume, and then a technical summary for each working group report, each of which, in turn, gets its own summary. And then they produce a synthesis report summing up all three volumes, or rather a full volume synthesis report with its own SPM, and then a shorter summary version called the longer report. And is all of this to make information readily available? Or is it to gloss over any inconvenient truths for alarmist journalists and politicians who want a simplistic and one-sided picture? Well, neither of the synthesis reports, which together total 267 pages, so it's not as if there wasn't space for it, mention CO2 fertilization or global greening. Each one makes a brief mention of urban greening as a means of cooling down cities, it apparently being big news to climate alarmists that it's cooler in the shade. But the idea that there might be leafier trees and more shade with extra CO2 in the air earns no mention, nor any of the other findings from the enormous scientific literature on the subject showing all the ways plants benefit from higher CO2. But it's not because the IPCC doesn't know. And another thing. While we've often complained about climate scientists adjusting historical surface thermometer data downwards to raise the amount of alleged warming since the early 20th century, a new study in Nature goes the other way, arguing that the sea surface temperature record from 1900 to 1930 is too cold. So, is the orthodoxy wrong? No, of course not. See, the study authors point out that it implies that the warming over 1900 to 1940, long considered natural, was less than previously thought, meaning natural variability is weaker. But here's the real kicker. The big adjustment to the historical record came not from uncovering new data or finding errors in previous studies, but from comparing historical observations to climate models and rejecting the former for the latter. It seems they couldn't get the models to reproduce the past, so they figured the data must be wrong. All hail the mighty computer, and never mind that silly old reality. But are we at least now allowed to point out that the surface record over land is contaminated with estimates biased too warm due to urban heat islands? Or, alternatively, made up altogether? UK journalist Ray Sanders, thanks to No Trick Zone for directing us to this, took it upon himself to visit the 302 official weather monitoring stations listed by the UK Met Office. They're often poorly sited, too close to cities, sources of heat, and so on. But his main finding was that 103 of the stations simply do not exist. Yet somehow the Weather Service reports data from them. In the newsletter, we also note yet another peer-reviewed study confirming that the Holocene climatic optimum was real and, in the case of that study, affected Antarctica. So, not regional, right? And finally, from the CO2science.org archive, bluegrass, that's Poa pratensis L, is not blue, nor is it confined to Kentucky. But 11 experiments from 2001 to 2018 show an additional 300 parts per million of CO2 in the air increased average growth of this popular green lawn grass across North America and Europe by 116%. So fire up those gas mowers, ladies and gentlemen. For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, and I can count to 100%.